Live. This is Dark Journalists. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's an amazing crowd already. And it's great to have you here with us as we're doing these Friday night X Series broadcasts. And the X Series is quite important, actually. It's something I've been working on for a while, making these connections come together. But it wasn't really until the last 3 months or so that things got into such a form that I felt that there was something there we could all investigate and all get our hands on. I do have to say that, what I'm going to do is recap everything that we've learned just in a quick capsule. So for those of you who've been following, you'll know very well the information I'm about to say. But this episode is going to be all about the theosophical influence around the X mystery, dealing with the UFO file, and it gets deep. I can tell you that this is going to be an explosive show. If you felt like the past couple have been explosive with information, trust me, this time we've got the New York socialite crowd, we have the theosophical crowd, we have the mystery school gang, and the deep state political machine all involved. And it goes all the way up to Donald Trump, who, as we've shown, is probably a lot more now, based on the information we have, way more informed than we had ever guessed about the UFO file and the implications of it, and maybe in the middle of a battle right now of another group who's also attempting to pull this information away. Of course, we had the biggest showdown on that front in 1963 with Kennedy leaning into the UFO file and really pulling that information back, and we know how that ended. But I will say that the information that we're going to bring forward today ties in all of the shows that we've done up to now, and then adds this incredible element of the mystery schools rising in, being another factor playing off the UFO file, because they have their own concerns relating to it, and humankind's grasp for destructive technology and information. So there is this incredible wall of secrecy going on the political side, which is absolutely fascinating. And then there's this underground struggle that we don't get to see very much. And then you have the players themselves. So it's really going to get deep tonight. Of course, we're joined by the amazing and lovely Olivia.
Hi, guys.
Olivia she's going to take questions for later tonight. Of course, as usual, we're going to take them in caps because it helps her to sort out, because we have a lot of people in the chat, and when you're dealing, with a few thousand people bouncing around, by the time we get to questions, there's no way anyone's going to see anything except stuff that's written in caps. And let's try to make the questions relate to the X series this time. Let's see how good you've been at your homework and what we've been learning here together. Okay, so just a quick recap on the X part. Of course, X came up in my research over and over again whenever I was looking into aspects of the UFO file and the politics that are used to keep it down and keep it under the radar. The letter X kept coming up, and that's from the very start. Of course, Frank Scully is someone I like to show at the beginning of these shows, because he did something really fascinating, which is I recommend everyone read his book about the flying saucers. And, he really researched this case in 1950. And of course, Frank Scully is where they got the name Scully for the X-Files, which is a funny little side note there. But Scully created, in a sense, the X-Files through this case. And the person that was assigned from the FBI side to research this stuff was someone who was deeply involved later in setting up Lee Harvey Oswald. So we have quite a web of deep state associations very early on, and that's Guy Bannister who was doing that. But in all of these FBI reports about the flying mysteries and about the discs and Roswell and all the rest of it, these X's come up over and over again. But also the people who were involved in the advanced technology, X's keep showing up around their research, around their names. So Walter Dornberger, of course, was a Nazi scientist, and he's somebody we brought over who was really a hardcore Nazi, but we needed him, according to von Braun, if our rocket program was going to get anywhere. Well, he got in charge of our X series, the most advanced space planes, and they flew in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, but by the 60s they were breaking records, and they hold records even now because they were so well designed using this X technology. And what was happening, and what I think is truly fascinating in relation to this, is, Dornberger shows up in odd places, much like Guy Bannister. Well, Dornberger showed up at the Ruth and Michael Payne aspect of the Oswald story because Oswald was staying with Ruth and Michael Payne. And Dornberger was Michael Payne's boss at Bell Helicopter. So quite a tight connection there to that X steganography that goes over and over through this UFO file, showing up through the deepest deep state events. And of course, the deepest deep state event being the JFK assassination, because it required so much risk to pull it off. But the stakes were that high for the people who were involved. But what we have to see is that the X moved and changed, and it went through different hands. And we can even see through the story that we told last week that Queen Elizabeth had her shot at the X, which was opening up Pine Gap for American development. This is a very crucial and little understood period of history when she steps in and develops that. And there's a lot of outcry from people in Australia about it and other peace activists. They don't understand how this kind of space observatory turned into a spy base. But Pine Gap is a crucial part of the stories, and always keep that in mind. We're going to keep bringing it back to Pine Gap because the X technology ended up there, and that's going to be crucial as we get along here, and in several other places as well. But in 1975, of course, the Queen, through the Governor General, got rid of Gough Whitlam just by decree. So it's almost as if someone stepped on American soil and said, from the UN, and said, well, Trump's out of there. Let's remove him. Snap their fingers and he's gone. And they took advantage of this little known statute in the Australian Constitution to do it. It's quite remarkable, actually, when you think about it. But what were really the stakes? Why would they go to that incredible level and cause a constitutional crisis, much like America faced the year before in 1974 with President Nixon? Well, Gough Whitlam was determined, one of his main pillars of his program was to get rid of Pine Gap, to get the U.S. out of Australia. And he was making real moves in that direction. And as a result, he was removed rather unceremoniously. And I think that there's a lot in that. And I think, as we learned last week with the Sir Peter Horsley information relating to Prince Philip and the Queen, and how Horsley has met this unusual Mr. Janus, as he says in his autobiography, which I kept because Horsley shows up again in this episode. There he is. Let's take a good look at him. He was basically the man in charge of the nuclear button for the UK. And his role as advisor to the Queen and Prince Philip, is huge. He's the largest person to have disclosed this ET aspect. And he was absolutely convinced that this Mr. Janus, who set up this meeting with him, was an ET, which is fascinating if you consider it. That's really putting his neck out there. Now, I do want to add, and I mentioned it in the last program, but I didn't really stress it, which is that what happened with him when he was going to write his autobiography, I think, is interesting, in that a car showed up and harassed him and ran him off the road, and he found out that his brakes were gone. So he was in this accident, but he survived. And, the police and the authorities try to attribute it to some terrorist thing, but he had been long retired. The truth was, the Janus information in the autobiography, in my opinion, is such a high-level revelation. Someone had pointed out to me that they had done a similar job on the brakes of the car that was carrying Princess Diana. I've looked into that a little bit, and there's so many things that go on about Diana and all the rest, and there's a lot of hyperbolic stuff, but there's no question that there were fundamental forces there inside of England that didn't like all of this disclosure that they were getting on their side. And although Diana wasn't talking about UFOs and things like that, she obviously was in opposition to the royal family at that point. And so I think it is a fascinating part. The UK aspect is powerful. And when the UK moves, Australia is involved and all these other places are involved. We really have to kind of look at their role, because when you get into the control that London has and so many other centers of the world, it's absolutely fascinating. Now, of course, one of the big major foundational pieces of the Theosophical Society takes us to Britain, and that's where we're going to go next. So in order to understand, I think that brings us up to date on the X factor. Of course, I should mention the LBJ library has the X letter, and this is the succession of presidents who've held on to this UFO file information and have kept it in what I call a stealth archive. Of course, Eisenhower has his time capsule X that's to be opened in 2053. John F. Kennedy never got to that point because when he was reaching for the UFO file, the entire establishment turned on him. LBJ kept his letter at the LBJ library to be opened in 2023. And that's it's an X letter, and I've shown it many times in this program. I'll probably show it again in this one. And then we get into President Nixon, who, as we have gone through, was pushing for disclosure on his own. He had kind of put through this program after working as VP on the CIA Blue Book, which is a totally different than the public kind of sham Blue Book. And I think it's important to keep in mind Nixon's role, probably the best informed on the UFO subject, the more that we look at him through history. And so we're definitely going to get into a lot of what he did, but suffice to say that he really, at this point in the early 70s, was looking at the UFO file as a source of bailing America out of our energy problems. And we were extremely energy conscious at the point. By the time we got to 1973 in the Arab oil crisis, Nixon's already heard from his main guy that our production of oil is going down for the first time and the prices are going up coming out of Saudi Arabia. So there was a lot of concern going on. We pulled up the article on, and someone was kind enough to go to the actual library there in Australia and pull up the actual copy of the newspaper article, which I'd had some clips of it online. And we've got this 1975 article, 1974 article, excuse me, where just before Nixon gets impeached, talking about how Tricky Dick is being helped out at Pine Gap with his sci-fi plans. And it says all in there that he's going to use this anti-gravity technology and revolutionize the whole energy sector. Of course, he never gets the chance to do it. Of course, on this program, we've been following the Nixon time capsule story, and Robert Merritt, who had been a Nixon agent, came forward here on this program February 14th, speaking about the time capsule and the letter that Nixon read to him beneath the White House relating to the UFO file. And of course, X comes in there because we have that whole sweep about Planet X. And there's the whole reference to this kind of energy independence that's coming for the US. Very crucial factor, as will be Nixon's relationship to Trump, which we've also demonstrated with facts and letters on this show. And that relationship, I think, is absolutely crucial when you're considering this time period, because Nixon's time capsule, being this one to surface while Trump is in office, is unusually good timing, if you look at it that way, because of this relationship we discovered of Nixon with Trump. And of course, I've shown articles here of USA Today and others where Trump keeps the letter from Nixon saying, "Run for president, I'll predict you win," with, saying Pat predicts it and stuff, being funny about it. But it's a Dear Donald letter, and we've shown pictures of them together at fundraisers with John Connolly, who was in the car with Kennedy was assassinated. So there's a lot of imagery, there's a lot of things there that help us understand that X isn't some theoretical proposition. It's there. It's a stealth archive through all of these different movements of the UFO file, through the various government agencies and the different administrations. And now we have Trump right in the middle of it, and we've learned so much about Trump and his knowledge of the UFO file through this series. Now, we do have to consider that when we go back, and we're going into the late 19th century, we've seen evidence of these different groups that were secret societies that were associated with the airships. And that's where we come in this episode, because the Theosophical Society and anthroposophy are absolutely crucial to the kind of new thought movement, the spiritual movements of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. And they'll play such a role in everything in American culture and the way that we turn eventually. For example, yoga was brought over by the Theosophical Society. The first cremation that happened in America legally, that's a theosophical enterprise. There's so many different things that we have now we just take for granted, the kind of focus around meditation and things like that. This all comes through these movements. And the movements, in many ways, were kind of covered up or kicked around, and in some cases, their own worst enemy. But I think it's absolutely crucial that we understand who these people were and how close to the UFO file they were and what their decisions were about it at that point, way before the public was even informed on a regular basis of what was going on with the huge flying saucer mystery in the late 1940s. So that's fantastic. How are you doing over there, Olivia?
Doing great.
How's everybody?
Really intense tonight.
Yeah, it's great.
Very passionate.
It's great to see everyone out there. I saw Tessa Dick up there, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about this, because I know you're just the kind of person who can figure it out. But it's great to have everyone here. You're watching Dark Journalist. And of course, before we break into everything, I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter, because that's the best way of us keeping in touch. Very often on these social media platforms, it's great. There are great ways for us to stay in touch, but the newsletter is the most direct way to have it right in your inbox. And it's a good kind of corridor of communication, I would say, but you're always staying updated because things around here change pretty quickly, as you can imagine. All right, so let's break into it. We're going to take us back in time to 1897. And really, the focus of this episode being Findhorn and Annie Besant and Theosophy and Rudolf Steiner, they're all so incredibly powerful and important that you could do, 2-hour shows on each of them. And before this is over, we probably will, because individually they're so crucial. And they believe so much in the work that they were doing. And there's such a contrast to some of the, the kind of lackadaisical, off the top, marketing hungry spiritual movements of today that it's, I really feel that we've degenerated in so many ways, but the core of what they've left us gives us the ability to move, gives us a model to shoot for. And yes, it's a century later and we know a lot more, but that incredible foundation that they've left us is something I think that we need to build on. So let's take a quick look here at this figure, who is Annie Besant. And Annie's very important because, we had a show on about a queen last week. It's a different kind of a queen. She really came through enormous difficulties in her life. And she developed things when she grew up in England around women's rights, and she developed things around workers' rights. There's so many things to go into her personal biography. I highly recommend a study of her life. And I think what we get the most of is that she was a seeker, and she wasn't afraid to stick her neck out. She was a powerful instigator for truth, and she was pushed down again and again and again through her life, including her early marriage in Victorian England to a preacher who just expected her to kind of do the dishes and stay at home. And there she was in the middle of this whole situation, studying spiritual texts, studying science, playing music, trying to learn languages. I mean, just an incredibly dynamic personality, very difficult life. And so at a certain point, she gets very involved with these, being an activist for these workers groups. And her husband gets really turned off. And she also gets involved in areas of contraception and things like that, and very early on in England, which I find very fascinating, because in Victorian England, even mentioning this was way off the charts, but she was suggesting literally that, we were in this situation where there were, it's this kind of Dickens period of England, and we're in this downswing where, there's so many people in poverty at that point, and there's no real solutions, and the corporations are cleaning up. Gee, it sounds familiar. Now, what she did, and I think what's extraordinary about the work that she did, is that she really brought the whole the tricky issues up, and she was really in the face of the establishment to do it. She absolutely was disappointed over and over again by her associations with the Christian church there, and she felt that a lot of that kind of spirituality had let her down because these people had turned against her. And she said, well, look, it's the most Christian thing in the world you can do to lead these workers' strikes and to try to get women's rights and stuff. So I don't know, like she just had this complete disconnect to a point where she became an atheist there. That was soon to change, but it is a remarkable thing to consider, this incredibly spiritual woman arriving at a point where she just didn't believe in anything anymore. And another kind of extraordinary picture of her from this period. Really, there are some people, and I have to say this without sounding too woo-woo, you take a look at their photograph and you are kind of lifted into a different reality. It's just a different kind of a sensation, and you get the impact of who they were and what they did. So as it turned out, I'll kind of go into the details in a nutshell. She meets up with Helena Blavatsky, who was the Russian founder of the Theosophical Society, who came to America in New York in 1875 and founded the Theosophical Society, which was dedicated to understanding higher truths and saying, their motto was the highest religion is truth. Blavatsky comes in on such a level, and I'm going to explain exactly how she got to be who she was from an esoteric point of view, and it bears a lot on Rudolf Steiner's work to do that, but I think it's crucial. In a nutshell, however, she teamed up with Henry Alcott, who was somebody who was deep in the political side, who was now writing articles for the New York Times, but he had been a retired colonel, and he had been on the equivalent of the Warren Commission for Abraham Lincoln's death, because there were a lot of questions after that, like exactly what went on here. And there still are many lingering questions about who was behind that, what happened to the assassin actually, and so on. There's a great mystery up here saying that, outside of Cambridge, Wilkes Booth's remains are actually buried there, and someone's trying to get a DNA test. And it's quite fascinating. But anyway, Alcott was a seeker, and he wanted to know about these deeper truths very much like she did. And there was a place up in Vermont called the Eddy Farm where all these kind of seances and things were happening. And she knew he was going to be there, and she showed up, and they had this incredible meeting. And really, Theosophy started shortly after. And he said that for all the different things that he went to try to investigate psychic phenomena, he never experienced anything like the incidents that he had with Madame Blavatsky. So truly extraordinary individual, incredible individuals meeting up here, and she had been through this kind of wild ride of a search, kind of in search of the miraculous. And so together they form this society. So by the time, she puts out Isis Unveiled, and she's releasing truths to the public that just have not been there before. And by the time she gets to the secret doctrine, that's where Besant comes in, because Besant, now having gotten over, the relationship with the preacher husband who sued her for her children, and she's in this incredibly bad position, living in London, working for a newspaper. But she's known as this kind of, they called her Red Annie because she was really, a firebrand putting on these strikes. She gets into the situation where she meets Blavatsky, and she turns into a follower, and she learns all of these different spiritual aspirations. Things really click for her there. So we understand Besant has this kind of theosophical viewpoint from there forward. And there's a lot in Theosophy, when we read it correctly, that lets us know how the mystery schools feel about the UFO file. And that's really the crux of what this episode is going to get to. Now, we have to remember that in this period, there are figures like Tesla, and we showed the combination and the connection between Tesla and Trump's uncle, John Trump, who the FBI called in after Tesla died and said, hey, check this guy's stuff out. Let us know what it is. And John Trump is reading those papers and he's saying, there's a lot in here about, different things. What are you looking for? And the FBI guy says, well, it's some kind of a weapon that takes down flying objects. The reference to flying objects there is not missed by those who know that just a few years later, unidentified flying objects became the buzz term for the whole UFO phenomenon. And that was coined by the government itself. So it's not something that individuals came up with. Okay, so Besant, being full-fledged, starts these different theosophical zones and lodges. Here is one of the early recruits. And let's see if anyone recognizes who that is next to Annie Besant. Okay, it's Rudolf Steiner. And Steiner started anthroposophy when he broke off from Theosophy, but for the first 9 years there, he was deep into Theosophy and really helped them sort of develop the European aspects, specifically Germany, which is going to be absolutely crucial here soon. So now that we understand Besant and we understand her relationship to Theosophy and that Steiner was a part of that and adopted into it, now let's get into the technology aspect. Okay, so I mentioned Nikola Tesla, but there was someone else in that period who had a lot of that kind of intuitive grasp of the technology. And he had his own supporters, and he had quite a legion of followers who were very enthusiastic about what he was researching. And his name was John Keely. Keely, I find absolutely fascinating. And I think we don't really understand the whole of what Keely was all about because his technology was hushed up so fast. But he's an absolutely crucial person for us to understand. I'm going to get his full name in here. And I think it's kind of important when we look at Keely. Yeah, one of the big things that he was doing was he was developing these sympathetic generators. And he was using this idea that basically with ether force, which was a big buzz term around these Theosophical Society, the different esoteric societies, and the inventors of the period, that there was this ether, this undefinable force that had to do with something that was almost like mesmerism in a sense, that we were giving our energy into it, and therefore these things could take flight. Now, Keely, as it turns out, he was someone who was in the know. He was American. He came from Philadelphia. And now he was developing these kinds of coils, which are very much like the Tesla coils. And I would say that he was doing quite well, and we'll see by the investors that he attracted that he may have been doing too well, and that's why the Keely stuff got so covered up, and really we understand so little about it. Keely, for me, when I look at his information, I say to myself, this is somebody who was on the cusp of transforming the entire way we look at technology now. And he was coming in on a very esoteric angle, which is why the Theosophical people and the like really enjoyed his work. And he's going to come up specifically. Let me grab all these. It's just too much tonight. I'm going to do my best to fit it into this show, but if not, it's going to go into overtime on a different show. And we'll do another one, which might be a segue on this one. But so let's look at Keely's developing this airship. And he's got a backer who is the man with the inheritance from the Astor family, a very important Astor, is backing him. And he's at a point where he's just about to break loose. And Astor takes him to the military and says, you see all these incredible things that Keely's been doing? Well, I'm going to give you an opportunity to demonstrate it for the military. So according now to Keely, he demonstrates for the military in 1897 a flying ship that can go 500 miles an hour. Now, Accordingly, they say to him, according to the account, they say to him, very interesting, very interesting. We don't see a military use for it. I don't think that part of the story is true. I think that they definitely saw a military use for it. But they may have said it to him, and they may have sort of gotten him out of the way, because what happens next is very fascinating. Now, in theosophical literature, airships are an absolute crucial crux that they rely on over and over again. You'll see it show up in the work of Steiner, the work of C.W. Ledbetter, who's another leader of the society, and in all of their references to Atlantis. And they have different people like A.P. Sennett and Scott Elliott who go into the history of Atlantis and how Atlantis had this advanced technology. Now, this is maybe about 20 years before the Casey material hits it. The Casey material goes much further. But certainly, I think that these guys coming through with this stuff in the late 1890s, there's a book called A Dweller in Two Worlds by Philos the Theban. And it's written in that period of time, just around the turn of the century. And there's a whole Atlantean airship aspect there. So this is very influential. There's something coming through the mystery schools that is being raised up. And it's the idea of the airship. Now, this is Scott Elliott's description of it about Atlantis. I'm going to read it to you quickly here. Quote, "If the system of water supply in the city of the Golden Gates was wonderful, the Atlantean methods of locomotion must be recognized as still more marvelous. For the airship or flying machine, which Keely in America is now attempting to produce, was then a realized fact." So this is one of the main theosophical writers referring to airships and referring to Keely, both in the same breath. I find that absolutely fascinating. His work is very interesting, and I highly recommend it. I'm not going to read it all here, but he's saying, the Atlanteans had flight. That's his basic understanding of it. And the way it was powered and so on, it was definitely, this kind of mystery, very much like Keely's talking about, this mystery energy. Now, when we get into, this is that's another shot of Steiner, who led anthroposophy. And I think what we get from Steiner, people know him through different things, even if they don't know him. So if you've heard of biodynamic farming, that's something that Steiner developed. If you've heard of Waldorf schools, that's something that Steiner developed. Eurythmy, that's Steiner again. So he's right in the heart of, he's a major innovator, and he's right in the heart of all these developments. And I guess what's important is that when we look at his developments and the work he was doing, you say to yourself, this is very interesting. He's now taking on, the mantle of theosophical type thinking, even though he is a scholar and he's recognized University of Vienna. He's done all of this incredible work. And, you say to yourself, what is compelling this scholar to go so deeply into this? Well, he had his own encounters with what he called the masters, which, there's also the masters that come out of this tradition in Theosophy. And they show up and basically kind of anoint somebody to go in a particular direction. And this is no question what happened with Steiner, along with a lot of very heavy-duty psychic experience from an early age. So Steiner also gets into the whole airship mystery, and he starts to discuss it. And he says, well, look, the Atlanteans had the airships, and they were very advanced technologically. But he gets up to these different points, and then he stops. And he says, I can't reveal the next aspect of this because basically it's off limits, because the mystery schools kind of forbid you to talk about it. This is going to be very crucial as we get into what exactly happens with the UFO file and how the mystery schools are actually a piece of the secrecy around it, which might be very different from what we would ordinarily think, like that there's one evil group up here in the political side that just wants to tamp down the UFO file and get it off the, get it off the headlines. Well, while that's very true, there are also other factors that are blocking this. And we're kind of right in the middle as the viewers, at the center of it all. So Steiner decides to come forward with certain information. He breaks away from the Theosophical Society at a certain point, not being happy with their methods. And he says, well, I'm looking at the situation, here we are, we've done all this spiritual work, etc., but we're rolling into World War I. So obviously there needs to be a quickening, and we need to really get the information out to the people. So all this stuff he's kept secret, he starts to dish out. And it's kind of like, I'll do it whether they like me or not. Like he's putting together the pieces, and he gets into a very interesting place with all this, because he's telling us that they had the advanced technology, but he's also saying that they had such powers there in Atlantis that it's been hidden for a reason. Because if we were to reacquire that information, that technology, then we would cause the same types of disasters and problems that the Atlanteans did. And that there's actually a program to see if we're ready for that kind of an information. This, I think, gets us into some really deep territory, because it's suggesting that the mystery schools themselves are confused about how much to let us know relating to what I'm calling here the X factor. And it leads, as we know, the X factor is used to clock that UFO file. Okay, so we've moved along through that. Steiner himself comes out and he says, well, here's what happened. Basically, I'm going to give you the outline of how things developed. In the 1840s, when scientific materialism became the dominant thought in the establishment, deep in the mystery schools, it sent earthquakes, because they understood that within a century, humankind's consciousness was going to get so degraded by scientific materialism, by reducing everything to a physical formula, that basically we're going to lose evolution. And so these groups that had kept these mysteries since the time of Atlantis made a crucial decision, not unanimously, to move forward and let information out to the public. Part of the things that they let out to the public was about life after death at the time. And, we have all these things about the Fox sisters and seances, and all the mediumship and all this stuff explodes in the 1800s. And this is the efforts of the mystery schools getting this information out and people picking up on it. So these schools work with that method for a while. According to Steiner, they stop because they realize people are getting hooked on this idea of life after death, and that life after death is exactly like this one, which was not the point. The whole idea was this kind of different thing to happen. So they look at other people and they try different experiments. And it doesn't work out. It's not going the way they want. And they arrive at Blavatsky because Blavatsky has a certain kind of mediumship, psychic awareness, esoteric understanding that is not something, is beyond 1 in a million. So they felt she has a lot of personality quirks, but we're going to try to work with her. And they move to bring her to New York, and they inspire her to reach out to Alcott. They make the Theosophical Society happen against the objections of some of these other groups. Now, Blavatsky, when she puts out Isis Unveiled, and she is gaining this attention because the book is absolutely revolutionary if you read it. It's such an esoteric doctrine revealed. It's stuff that hadn't been revealed really since Egyptian times. And there's so much information in there relating to true history, relating to Atlantis, relating to all these different factors. And so aspects of these mystery schools and secret societies that are deeply involved with the political scene, especially in America, according to Steiner, were threatened by Blavatsky and what she was doing. So at a certain point, she approached them and said, let me into your mystery school, even knowing that they only allowed men to enter these mystery schools. And they said, no way, we're not going to do that. And she said, well, if you don't do it, then I'm going to reveal more stuff, basically. So the mystery schools had a really big problem with her, and the political scene had a really big problem, because if she exposed more of this, then a lot of that political hold. Now, this no doubt gets us into the Masons. It gets us into different groups. And it gets us into the secret society aspect, which was really, it it was flying so low under the radar at that point, but you had various exposures of things. There'd be little flare-ups, people trying to, get rid of groups like the Masons, and suddenly they start to think that every Mason was some kind of a person who was up to no good, and they had their own kind of Illuminati internet buzz back then. So what happens when we get to this point with Keely and Theosophy and Steiner is, the nature of the situation is these groups are letting out, these mystery schools are letting out information, but there are aspects inside of that who are worried they're letting out too much. And reincarnation becomes a big piece of that too. They start to think, whoa, hold up on it. And even though they're facing the scientific materialism, and the threat of religions collapsing and all the rest of it, they still want to keep their secrets. So when Keely is coming out and suggesting that these flying machines can be moved with etheric energy, and he's talking about harmonic resonance technology, these are the same types of things on a different end of the spectrum that gave Tesla so many problems. Tesla's working with things that were revolutionary and infinitely practical. And in a way, the Keely information is suggesting that the technology refers to consciousness on a certain level. So it's a big problem for the people involved. Keely gives these demonstrations. In these periods of time, there are groups of people who study and they look at different types of information relating to the airship period. And we have all these airship sightings that are seen across America, and nobody knows what they are or who they are, where they came from, and all the rest of it. So it's a very unusual situation because Keely is demonstrating what he claims are airships that can go 500 miles an hour to the military. So in the middle of all this, we have the situation where Jacob Astor comes forward and he says, I'm going to fund Keely. And Keely gets the equivalent of $5 million back then, 1897. Let's think about that. It's quite remarkable money for him at that period. And a lot of the things I think that Keely is working on is he's developing things on a number of levels because it looks at energy, it looks at air flight. But the airship aspect is what we're going to really stick to on this until we get the right kind of answers. All right. Now, let's get a picture on this because we're going to understand that Keely, Astor, and our friend this is Astor here. And, he's John Jacob Astor IV. He's a descendant of the original Astor, and the Astor was the first millionaire in America. Incredible money and incredible power in that New York scene, the New York power scene. Real power brokers, and his great-great-grandfather made all the money in fur trading, and in real estate development in a very early Manhattan, which had lots of real estate to develop. Of course, we have our own real estate developer as president right now, and you guessed, if you felt that this was going to arrive at his doorstep eventually, you guessed right. But interestingly enough, he takes a kind of a liking to Keely, and he decides this guy's onto something amazing. And he has such an impression, or Keely makes such an impression on Astor that he decides, I have to kind of get behind this guy. So he gives them the money and he introduces them to the military, and he's a real mover and a shaker. During this period, John Jacob Astor will write this book, which is A Journey in Other Worlds. This is quite remarkable. In this book, it's the year 2000, and we're sending people off to Jupiter. And there's a whole space program overview and how we get there, and there's the description of these crafts. And there's no doubt that a lot of this he's getting from Keely, but also it's suggesting this real deep understanding of the space program development and how it's going to influence things over the next century. The book is kind of astonishing in a way, not that it's so well written, but my own impression of it is was one of those things that where he's letting out information that he's heard in these elite circles relating to this curricular technology, this kind of outside the box stuff that Keely and Tesla and people of that ilk are concentrating on. So he has this incredible impact on him. Now, a few things about Keely that I think we're going to find important, or Astor rather. Astor, his brother-in-law is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So that circle, the New York power elite circle, is very crucial. He has incredible wealth, and he is he has this inheritance from his great-grandfather, who came over here with no money and became the richest man in America. Quite unusual, but not unlike Trump's grandfather, interestingly enough, when we get into him. Both German immigrants, and both came here with nothing and developed real estate and became powerhouses. But both have a real key tie-in to the UFO file and this technology. So when we're looking at the technology and we're looking at these different influences, we come to Astor. And Astor really represents the financing behind this whole situation. Astor, as it turns out, will die on the Titanic, bringing his pregnant wife back to America from England. And it's quite a story. And when we're going to get deeply into all the connections around Astor, but one of the important ones I want to really have us pay attention to here is the one relating to Rudolf Steiner. This is a very unusual picture of John Jacob Astor in a kind of ritual garb. You could say a costume garb, Louis XIV style. But we get an example of him as a very kind of extroverted person with a lot of a sense of mystery about him. And when he's coming back from the Titanic, they just had visited Egypt, and he made Egypt a regular stop in that period. And this is before King Tut's tomb was found, etc. This is a guy who's interested in the mysteries of life, and that's why he's so close with Keely. And Keely is right in the heart of the Theosophical Society. So the Theosophists really love him because he's not only coming in on the technology angle, he's also saying, you know what, the technology relates to how we advance. So spiritually. And he's saying that, we have this sympathetic vibration engine, and when 6 people concentrate on it, it levitates. I mean, he's going into serious esoteric territory. But as it turns out, Keely, who is a favorite of Theosophy and backed by Astor and all the rest of it, dies unexpectedly in 1898. And it's an unusual situation. He's 60 years old, and it's an illness that comes on quickly and all the rest of it. I'm not sure there's much we can say relating to his death and how suspicious it is, but the illness does develop fairly quickly, and shortly after he gives the military this demonstration of what he can do. So if someone were to say, do you think they're related? I would say it would have to be looked into, but certainly it's unusual timing. All right, so what happens is there was a person who has been working along with Keely, who was not Astor, who was another banker from Boston, and you'll find that the whole story about Keely revolves around Boston over and over again. So Keely, he has this in his will that he wants this banker to be a part of developing his work further. And his wife goes along with it when he dies. And so this banker brings the information back to Boston, and he's got everything there. And this big scandal breaks out and it's really like the genuine hit piece of the time, where they say, oh, Keely's engines were just a scam and a hoax. And all these people come forward looking, oh, we want our money and all this kind of stuff. And they really freak out the banker who's helping Keely with the whole thing, but not Astor, who was stepped back from the picture just before Keely died. So interestingly enough, they go after this guy, and this guy, what he does is he packs up the information, and he gets 12 of his best people to put together these mail packages going to the UK of all of the stuff that Keely had, all these little engines and all of these kind of black papers and white papers on the stuff and all the rest of it, and all the blueprints. And the people ask him, where is this going to go? Well, it's going to her. Annie Besant. She is in England, and she's awaiting the arrival of the Keely technology, which is under siege now with all these people trying to get their hands on it. And it's obviously, there's some system in play where these people who want to get their hands on it and cause the scandal decide, now's our chance. You know, we'll actually get his technology and submerge it. Very much the same way they wanted to do with Tesla years later. It took them a little longer because he was so prominent. Now, what happens is there's a few different stories about what happens with the technology and what Annie Besant does with it. But the most reliable, and I will read it here later, but I'll tell you first, the most reliable source on this says that Besant realizes after drinking in the implications of Keely's death and the technology, she says, we have to hide the technology. It's too dangerous. If this stuff gets to a wider public, if this X technology is developed, these people will use it to annihilate each other. This isn't the time or the place. The culture needs to be educated first. It needs to be culturally enhanced. It needs to have ethics drilled into it. It needs to have a spiritual focus. It needs to have a goal. And so according to that source, she decides this is something that we need to kind of put aside and let out at some other point because the culture can't handle it. So Besant moves there in that time period, working with what she claims are the masters, working with Ledbetter because now Blavatsky has died, and really reaching out and developing throughout the world. In India, Gandhi was a great disciple of Theosophy, and the person who had the biggest influence on Gandhi was Annie Besant. You're not going to hear that very often, but if you look deep in the details, you're going to find that's exactly what happened. And also that he read The Key to Theosophy and spent time with Besant. And Besant had been busy working on home rule for India since the 1890s, as well as home rule for Ireland. But what I want to bring up here about the technology and what Besant was thinking of and in her development of Theosophy is one of the key things that she does is she goes to Australia and she meets with the Prime Minister of Australia in 1922. She develops one of the most robust theosophical chapters in Melbourne. Now, what I think is interesting is there are many connections that we've made relating to the UFO file having to do with Australia. And Australia is where the X file eventually lands. The UFO file has its kind of free reign period in Pine Gap. So this early interaction with Besant and the Australian Prime Minister is fascinating because, of course, here she is, this woman talking about esoteric principles and meeting with masters and all the rest of it. But who's rolling out the red carpet for her? It's the Australian Prime Minister. That's something that we need to understand as we go forward here, because the Theosophical Society, I'm going to mention another very prominent member of Theosophy, Thomas Edison. There's a number of people who understood that Theosophy and the general wave of that information of wisdom teachers raising up the culture, that is absolutely crucial for the development and evolution of mankind. And we don't get to that until, we don't get to the X factor and the ability to use it until the culture is raised up. This is where the mystery schools are coming from. That's why when Steiner is talking mid-sentence, when he's describing the airships, when he's talking about Atlantis, he says, I can't say anymore, because there's a point at which if we discovered or rediscovered the technology that the Atlanteans possessed, that we would go down the same route. This is something that we have to keep in mind with the mystery schools. But let's put this on the record. Keely talked about free energy, anti-gravity, sympathetic vibration, and etheric forces to power airships. It's pretty advanced stuff for the late 19th century. And I think that there's a kind of a co-partnership where Astor and his money and his great interest in things dealing with going off planet, etc., is lining up with, on the other side, the theosophical knowledge about what it's really all about. So let's jump ahead almost a century, and then we're going to come right back into the middle of this and talk about Findhorn and how Findhorn relates to all this. I could just go to Findhorn now, but that would be too easy, too methodical. Before we go any further, how are you doing over there, Olivia?
Excellent.
How is everyone tonight?
Very intense, very passionate.
Well, it's great. You know, have your questions ready because I want to have a robust Q&A at the end of this. And now, before we go any further, I think it's important to point out Trump's relationship here. That's Brooke Astor, who became basically the kind of final matriarch of the Astor family. And she, you know, she was close. She lived to 105, and she was close to Trump to the extent that the Trumps were the major real estate developers in New York, but the Astors got there first, and they were the ones who developed the Waldorf Astoria, and they were the ones who are, you know, behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art and all the different things that she did. She really brought forward the philanthropy aspect that the Astors weren't really particularly good at when they started. And as a result of that, there's a lot of controversy about her own son taking advantage of her. And there was a gigantic court case. And, you know, a lot of dirt came out about it. But as it turns out, the son had become a CIA agent. And he had been rewarded a number of ambassador posts to Kenya under President Ford. And it's just unbelievable deep state player. So the Astors are just right in the heart of the mystery, and Trump's relationship to them, I think, is fascinating. But John Jacob Astor IV, who's the crucial one that we pointed out, who was supporting Keely, he's someone who appears to have really rocked the boat. And you know, it's funny when we look at the Titanic and thinking about Astor being on the Titanic. He's one of the richest men in the world at the time. A number of millionaires, of course, were killed on the Titanic. And there have been stories out there about the Titanic being a way to clear the decks and get rid of a certain group of elites that wouldn't go along with the Federal Reserve Act. Now, I can't go into the details on that here, but when I'm looking at some of these elites who are working on advanced concepts, and some of them who are working on things like philanthropy and all the rest of it, I think that they're at odds with this other group. And I think that develops so that by the time the UFO file bursts on the scene full-fledged in the late 1940s, there's already train tracks. There's already a foundational base for all of it, which is a crucial thing, I think, if we're going to understand. Okay, so now we're going to jump back to the 1950s. As we discussed in the previous episode, Sir Peter Horsley, who was the advisor to Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth in the 50s, and was the head of Strike Force and, you know, an air marshal and really just one of the top guys. He talks about his interaction with this Mr. Janus, who he meets in a dark apartment based on a tip from a general. And a lot of the people who try to connect him up actually disappear into the woodwork. And Janus is telling Horsley, you know, the off-world visitors basically checking in on the planet because of your the possibility of a nuclear exchange. and he starts telling him where the nuclear bases are. So when we look at this conversation that they have, and it's in his autobiography, Sounds from Another Room, it's out of this world. And I highly recommend it. But I think if we're going to really understand maybe the roots of what that conversation blossoms into, because Mr. Janus disappears afterwards and there's no follow-up, but let's keep in mind that the thing that he wanted the most from Horsley in that discussion was a meeting with Prince Philip to talk about the UFO issue. This gentleman is named Peter Caddy. Some of you more hardcore esoteric types will recognize him. He is the founder of Findhorn, but guess what? He was Peter Horsley's best friend, and they had gone to RAF training together, and they were close. And Findhorn now is something that we need to get into, and I know there's a lot of people out here who know about Findhorn, but I'm going to give kind of the cursory overview. Findhorn is this incredible garden in Scotland. They grow the biggest vegetables, and they're scientists who've looked into it, they couldn't tell exactly how this is done, and it's just this amazing place. And they come from this very spiritual perspective. Peter Caddy was the founder, along with Eileen Caddy and Dorothy McLean, who were basically channels, and they were channeling all this information. So at a certain point, these different kind of rough circumstances lead them to what's basically this kind of barren wasteland in Scotland. And they don't understand really how the information and the great channeling that's been done takes them here, all this guidance. And Caddy redevelops these ideas from Rudolf Steiner and creates this incredible kind of biodynamic farming environment. And, it's claimed by the people who founded Findhorn that they start interacting with these divas and plant divas and all the rest of it. So it's quite a remarkable story, but nonetheless, the proof aspect is clear, which is that they have this incredible garden and they've run it on spiritual principles and all the rest of it. Founded in the 60s, and many people who were associated with it became very well known. For example, David Spangler, who is, as far as New Age stuff is concerned, was quite well known. He's still out there, but interestingly enough, Findhorn and its founders are all about this UFO factor, and I'm going to bring it in here. So first of all, Spangler, in a conversation talking about his biography, says, quote, "Throughout my childhood and adolescence, I was aware of this other dimension, but I honestly didn't know what to do with it. When I was 14, my father got a job in Phoenix, Arizona, and we moved there. They were living in Morocco before. And he said, when my parents, we lived in Morocco, my mother and father had experiences of UFO sightings. So they found a UFO group in Phoenix. And for 3 years before I went to college, I was involved in the UFO subculture out in Arizona." Or maybe somebody from Arizona can tell us about the UFO subculture, which can get, quote, "pretty wild. It offered me a whole new set of concepts concerning spirituality." Okay, so we can see there that Spangler, one of the key people of Findhorn, has this early association with UFOs. But it is nothing compared to what Eileen and Peter Caddy, who founded Findhorn, have. And I'd say they're very important people, and I think they did the incredible thing, which is they actually took this vision of theirs spiritually and grew this amazing garden. And so many people have come through there, and there's a lot of understanding around it. But something came up which I thought was fascinating, which was somebody went deep into the background, like I was doing on Findhorn, and they found that the whole idea and the whole thing, if we think of Peter Caddy and his relationship to Peter Horsley, who was the Queen's advisor, the head of Nuclear Strike Force in England, who had a meeting with this Mr. Janus, who he felt was an ET, and put that in his autobiography, and almost got run off the road. By the way, Horsley's biography came out in the late 90s, so far, way after all this stuff happened. But let's keep with Findhorn for a moment. So Findhorn is this kind of bizarre situation. You have these spiritual people developing this incredible garden using Rudolf Steiner techniques, because Caddy was an active proponent of Steiner's work and anthroposophy and theosophy. So there's that thread there of these theosophical thinkers getting deep, deep, deep into the UFO factor. So when we're looking at this, we see that Findhorn, Peter Caddy, and his wife Eileen, well, in the 1950s, Peter Caddy wrote this 8,000-page dossier on what to do about the UFO aspect. And he gave it to his friend Peter Horsley, and he said, I really want to get this. And he was doing the kind of channeling that you see in so many of these groups early on in the 50s relating to space contacts and this kind of spiritual space interface. And he's working with a channel named Nora. And he's doing this, he's coming to this kind of headspace about what they're doing here, and they're here to save the earth and all the rest of it. And he's taking his medium women along with him, doing this mediumship, dealing with the UFO factor. So he says to his friend Horsley exactly what Janice said to Horsley, which is, I want a meeting with Prince Philip to give him this dossier and this real incredible overview. Can you set it up? Well, it turned out Prince Philip and the Queen were traveling, but Sir Peter Horsley, he did for his friend what he did not do for Mr. Janus, which is he set up a meeting. So Peter Caddy gets there at the meeting and he says, you know, chit chat, and they were respecting him for his views and all the rest of it, his history. He cannot bring himself to give them the dossier that deals with the UFO factor. And so what he does instead is he says to Horsley, look, who was their kind of the person who was in your position previously? Who was the military advisor guy? And so he gets it to him and he has a conversation with him, and they have this conversation, and he says, oh yeah, well, they're very interested in it, and it's about time that we really get something substantive. Thank you for this, and so on. So Caddy goes through the 50s sponsoring event after event dealing with the UFO aspect, and he is going through this whole channeling process of saying, basically, the Space Brothers are here and are going to save humanity from the nuclear problem, and talking about the economic aspect and the environmental impact and all the rest of it. So it is classic stuff, but it's an incredible mix of theosophical teaching, the philosophy, the masters, and all the rest of it, mixed with this space stuff now, dealing with these visitors, and the visitors being these kind of exalted, Pleiadian style, basically. And they set up Findhorn early on in such a way that people come there expecting that they're going to see these incredible UFO displays. Now, interestingly enough, in the history, there's a fascinating publication article, actually, by Andy Roberts and David Clark called In Advance of the Landing, the Findhorn Community. So he goes through the whole entire aspect and how they airbrushed all the UFO stuff out of their past for some reason, which is pretty interesting because the entire crux of Findhorn was set up around this idea of the interaction of these higher space beings dealing with humanity. And then it moved into, we're talking to divas. So we're dealing with very interesting tracks of thought as we look at these two things. And it has to be noted because Findhorn is a crucial aspect. And trust me, the X part is going to show up very hardcore here. But we already have the Steiner Theosophical connection. And now we're dealing with Peter Horsley and Mr. Janus. And Horsley being Peter Caddy, the founder of Findhorn's best friend. Is everyone still with me? Wow, it is quite a web of connections here. But I think Caddy is crucial because in his autobiography, he does mention the UFO aspect. And he does mention how Findhorn was set up around this, even though the founders, the general community of Findhorn doesn't talk about this anymore. And so here's a couple of quick things about Caddy, because I think it's important. Caddy was commissioned into the RAF soon after commencement of hostilities in 1939, entering the catering branch of the service. And in 1943, he was posted to India, where he developed a taste for the mountain landscapes of the Himalayas, Tibet. He was especially fascinated by what he considered to be this, last Western expedition to Tibet, just prior to the Chinese invasion. So he's getting kind of you know, the spiritual mindset from being around Tibet and the Himalayas as part of the RAF. So he gets involved with this woman, Nora, and then this other woman, Sheena, and they're on the spiritual path, and they both receive guidance, and they channel these different beings and all the rest of it. So that's all a long story, but the crucial aspect of it is that he's saying through the guidance that the extraterrestrials were extremely worried about the state of Earth and man's evolution. It was essentially a warning of impending ecological disaster if humanity didn't change its evil ways. Sounds familiar, right? And how they operated. Information was also given in these sessions about flying saucers themselves and how they operated. Caddy received an inner prompting that he should put together a report on the nature of these messages, a professional report which he would compile using his training from RAF Staff College. The report was called An Introduction to the Nature and Purpose of Unidentified Flying Objects. I'm going to read that again. An Introduction to the Nature and Purpose of Unidentified Flying Objects. It clearly outlined who and what lay behind the increasing number of UFO sightings and the reason the Earth was being visited. So Findhorn's founder, best friends with the Queen's advisor, Peter Horsley, develops this incredible outline, 8,000-page outline, using this channeled information about what the UFO aspect is really all about. And he's somebody who comes out of that theosophical mindset. The anthroposophical mindset is what he uses to develop the garden at Findhorn. Anthroposophy and theosophy being like that until Steiner splits off and develops his own thing, which includes biodynamic farming, which is what Caddy picks up on. So I think we're clear that Findhorn is related to this whole aspect of the Theosophical Anthroposophical societies, and now it's related to the UFO file because it's bringing forward all of this space channeling information. That's the roots of Findhorn. Interestingly enough, when we go into Caddy and we look at his relationship with Horsley, we're looking at somebody who is driven, is absolutely passionate to get this thing out relating to the ET factor. But then suddenly when he gets into the Findhorn garden and they're talking with divas and all the rest of it, he drops it like a hot potato. Now, I found in literature relating to Findhorn, and there are so many references here, I'm not sure which one to give out as the start, that everything that they were using, they had scientists there checking out how do you develop these incredible strawberries and all the rest of it. And they said it's an X factor. And the scientists said, picked up on it and said, oh, it's an X factor. And Caddy makes a reference to Steiner referring to the X factor. It's a spiritual factor, which is how they do this. Now, it's quite remarkable because the X shows up here in a remarkable way with somebody with Caddy's background in the Royal Air Force developing this really incredible community. Now, one of the people who was in this kind of space brother world in the 1960s is someone named Daniel Fry. And Fry was big in the 50s because he wrote a book called The White Sands Incident, where he's working on developing, you know, it's weird too, because I think sometimes we play these people down because of the kind of wildness that went on in the 50s relating to Venusians and all the rest of it, and a lot of the sci-fi. But when we look at people like Van Tassel, who was a big space brother guy, and we have to realize he worked for Howard Hughes and had incredible expertise around airplanes. This guy was the CEO of a rocket company, and he worked for one of the most famous companies that dealt with, you know, airplanes and rockets and all the rest of it. His name is Daniel Fry. Let's take a quick look at him. Now, Fry is interesting because his book, The White Sands Incident, is sort of the classic of the period. And in short, he is there working at White Sands, and there's a weekend when a lot of people are out or gone, and it's just him and kind of the workmen, and one of these crafts land, and they tell him, we'll take you from New Mexico to New York in 20 minutes. And it's this incredible kind of get up where he hears these voices. He goes into the craft, and then they show up and they look just like normal human beings, and they're talking and all the rest of it. This is one of the crafts that he said, let's see if you can see that. That's the craft that he said was one of theirs. There's only three things about Fry that I think are important. One, Fry was close with the Findhorn group, and he's mentioned in Caddy's autobiography. Fry turns up at Findhorn and stays there, gives lectures and all the rest of it. He's an important figure, and he's a tie-over from their space period where they were really talking about UFOs and everything else to when they become popular as kind of a hippie commune developing this incredible garden. But Fry, who's one of these, he does all the major, when they do Contact in the Desert now, that's Van Tassel and Fry who developed the Integratron and did all these places at Giant Rock and all the rest of it. That's where they held the major UFO gatherings in the late 50s. So he certainly had a major role in it. Fry worked for Aerojet, and the company was Aerojet General 8. And it was Aerojet General X8. This is important because they were working on the Aerojet X8 rocket, upper atmospheric research vehicle, X-plane. So Fry, there's so much here about Aerojet General, but Fry, again, the incredible X factor coming into play. So what do we have? We have, running through the Findhorn history, this incredible alignment with the UFO aspect. Then at a certain point, they drop it and they start developing this incredible garden and talking to divas and developing the spiritual end, very much like a theosophical, anthroposophical approach. In fact, they use anthroposophy and reference Steiner in all their materials. So if you're looking at the work relating to Findhorn and the garden that they created, which is remarkable, and, you can only have the highest appreciation for these people. But what's fascinating is the X factor is there. When the scientists get there, they say it's an X factor. And they apparently got this term because Caddy said, well, Steiner said it was an X factor that would make it do it. So Steiner, working with the biodynamic farming, creating this X factor, again, very much like Keely in his unusual experiments saying there's this ether energy. Science supposedly never discovers what it is. But he's saying, it's free energy, anti-gravity. Well, we're talking about that a century later, and we still don't have it. So what happens when these forces move in to put the clamp down on Keely? And I think this is important because we can look at Keely's work, and we can say, well, he's another guy out there like Tesla, but he had Astor behind him. And Astor had written these science fiction books, and Astor was part of the most important family in America. It's basically the Astors and the Rockefellers. So, this aspect, when somebody grabs the technology and submerges it, suppresses it, before they could get their hands on it and really smash the whole thing, we know very well that his business partner, Keely's business partner, when he dies, ships it off to Annie Besant, and Besant hides it so that technology doesn't fall into the wrong hands and people don't wind up using this incredible stuff to annihilate each other, and as they did in World War I and World War II. Well, if they had this stuff, it'd be a whole lot worse, if we can imagine. So there is this understanding there. Now, if we go a little bit deeper into Steiner's work, he talks about the war of all against all, which is something that's supposed to happen if it's not prevented, and not in the not so distant future for us. From him, it was over 100 years away. But he understood world wars that were coming and the battles, and he shaped it into a gigantic philosophical argument about, his esoteric vision, seeing what forces were behind it and where the clash was really coming from. When we look at Steiner's work and we see that when he gets to 1950, 1916, he says, I can't hold on to this stuff anymore because I was keeping it secret, but I'm going to let so much of it out, even though the lectures and the people who are taking down the lectures aren't making the most accurate notes. Everything has to go out. And even though the most elite of the Steiner students only had this information originally, he pushes it all out, which is why when you get, around Steiner, it's incredibly prolific. There's so much stuff that he was out there doing and people taking down his lectures. But he decided that if we were going to fail and the World War was going to happen, he considered it a failure of anthroposophy and theosophy. So he was like, you know what, let it out, because that thing about gripping the information and keeping the secrecy on isn't working, because the wrong people are still in charge of the world, essentially. Now, I think it is crucial that when we look at his viewpoint and we think about what Besant did when she said, we can't let this out, they're both two aspects of the same principle, which is they want the culture and the society to assimilate the important information without blowing itself up. But they're working closely. They're at the heart of the X File because they're working with the early version of this X factor. And it's rising up, and it's rising up through the fact that when the mystery schools decide the reincarnation aspect can get let out, many of those reincarnations, like with the Casey material, like with the Steiner material, go back to Atlantis. And what will they remember? They'll remember the incredible technology that they had and the moves to recreate it. So therefore, they have to move and do this. They have to take this chance and let this information out. But what they're objecting to, aspects inside of those mystery schools, is that if we get our hands on the information and the knowledge, we might misuse it. Just consider how the Nazis took a little tiny sliver of Blavatsky's information and decided to completely pervert and distort what she was talking about, relating to the Aryan race and all the rest of it. So when we look at these groups and we look at the nature of the information that they possessed and how they let it out to the public, I would say you're looking at the very best when you're looking at anthroposophy and the beginnings of theosophy and the theosophy that Annie Besant tried to bring to the world. Now, theosophy faltered when they promoted Krishnamurti as the world teacher, and Krishnamurti was an amazing teacher, but he wasn't the savior, and that's what they were promoting him as. And he dissolved the Order of the Star by 1930, and Besant died in 1933. I think Besant, and we have to really take a look at her role in this whole thing, because Besant is the crucial link in theosophy. And she also swoops in and kind of saves the day when Keely's information is submerged, so that at least the society has the information and figuring out who could develop this kind of technology. So again, there she is in the heart of world affairs, another person who makes this incredible difference. Findhorn, being so closely related to the friendship here between Peter Horsley and Peter Caddy, Horsley sets up a meeting for Caddy to talk to the royal couple. I mean, it's incredibly high-level connections around the UFO factor, and that Caddy becomes so informed and creates this incredible garden using these women psychics and Rudolf Steiner methods. We're looking at a whole picture, a whole stream of thought that comes together and brings us to, what was supposed to be a kind of enlightenment period where even through the 60s, there's so many new age groups that develop. There's higher consciousness. There's ideas of reincarnation. There's ideas of life after death. I mean, we pretty much, 100 years after Theosophy was founded, by 1975, we had a lot of these ideas in the public consciousness. One of the crucial things that Steiner said relating to anthroposophy and how important he felt that it was that if it failed, and this is in 1916 that he says it, that its next term, its next opportunity to basically move the world into a more esoteric understanding would be 100 years later, a century later, which is the period we're in right now. And we can see that there's been an awful lot of suppression relating to the UFO file, relating to consciousness. And we can see that even when there are impressive people from the past, like Astor, who was trying to push Keely's information and all the rest of it, it's a combination of sources that are required. It's political forces, it's money forces, it's people on the ground. And that the situation around the X steganography with these political forces trying to maintain the UFO file using this X as a developmental stage of tracking it through different administrations, and these administrations leaving these stealth archives behind telling us, look, this is the nature of the thing. When this comes out, remember the work I did on it. But over and over again being clamped down by what? It is this force operating, what Peter Dale Scott would call the deep state. But now we can see there's a mystery school aspect to it too, because when they moved out, when people like Blavatsky came forward, according to Steiner, what they try to do was block her vision, her occult vision, and keep her in a kind of esoteric enslavement. And this was attempted for many years. And, her work did get very erratic toward the end. So I take what he says about this extremely seriously. And so we came in on this kind of different angle, looking at the X in history through the figure of someone like Besant and the ripples of the work that Besant did, opening up our consciousness to this thing. We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing now to get our hands on this higher understanding? Is it enough to just rant and rave about governments keeping secrecy, or rant and rave about your party getting in or getting out, or rant and rave about the president? It goes a lot deeper, but we have to understand who these people are and the challenges that they face. When we looked at the relationship of Trump's uncle and Vannevar Bush, it tells us so much about the struggle going on at the highest level with the deep state trying to remove President Trump. And of course, James Comey's information that just came out is another piece of this. More attempts to remove Trump, and regardless of where you stand politically, we can't let the deep state or the CIA remove a sitting president that was elected duly. But Trump has a few things on his side. That deep relationship with Astor, there's no question that the Astors knew a great deal about the X and this X factor. And of course, they had developed all their money in real estate in New York, and here was Trump doing the same thing, cultivating these close relationships. But Trump and the close relationship we've uncovered here with Richard Nixon, again, that information, the level that Nixon was on, dealing with the UFO file, we have to look at it and understand the incredible information that Trump holds in relation, the cards that he holds. That's why he's one of the most dangerous figures for the deep state, regardless of what you think of his politics, because he's not under their thumb relating to this, because he has these independent sources that have given him the information. And his uncle, looking into Tesla's work and being called by the FBI to do that, and being the understudy of Vannevar Bush, who, of course, was at the very heart of the UFO file and our examination of the program, that gives us the outline to understand the times we're in now. So we're not simply looking at history. But I wanted to do it through Theosophy because I think they made some of the early moves, because they were, in fact, a public mystery school. And I think they understood this. They did relate and they did talk about off-world visitors. They were one of the earliest groups to do it. But this idea of Atlantis and the airships and bringing our consciousness into that was, I think, a crucial first step for us. There's so many things relating to the information they were trying to keep from us because they didn't want us to go down this road of destruction, which, it's funny, when we come up against incredible tension, like World War I, like World War II, it seems like incredible people came out of the blue to rescue the scene. Blavatsky, Besant, Casey, Rudolf Steiner, Krishnamurti, all these remarkable people and remarkable thought right around this period. And these wars that happened anyway. But these people gave us the foundation because they basically had a spiritual mission and they saw it coming. So I think coming at the X and the UFO file from the experience of their efforts. Now, here it is 100 years later. And there are people like Steiner who said in 100 years, we will have a chance to tackle this again if anthroposophy fails in 1916. So it's 100 years later. And the question is, do we have a chance? Is Steiner right? And certainly the understanding of the X steganography, moving the UFO file, is a crucial part of that. We've seen it go through everything from intentional communities, mystery schools, government projects, and a variety of different places through these different letters and the administrations. The X is the piece that's left out there because one of the things that they talk about in relation to mystery school understanding and esoteric school understanding is this. You can see something and recognize it if you're a brother in those schools that other people would just pass off as a normal thing. That's why we need to understand steganography is different from just having this kind of code, like Morse code. People understand that it's a code, and you might try to break the code and all the rest of it. And there are all these different kind of crypto solutions on that. But when you get into it, when we're looking at steganography, when you see it as an average person, you don't know what it is. So when we as average people look at the X's in these crucial spots relating to the UFO file, modern technology, even Findhorn, we wouldn't see it. But these brothers, these members, these mystery school adepts would be able to see the very same thing and understand what it meant. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. And a good example is a Rubik's Cube, because a Rubik's Cube, everybody knows it's a puzzle and they all try to figure out what it is. And that was what made it such a crazy phenomenon. But steganography doesn't work like that. It's hidden in plain sight. And that's the very crux of the types of revelations. And I think this is a year of revelations. We're moving into 2018. And I think if we understand the impact that the groups had around the last turn of the century, 19th into 20th, like Theosophy, like the Gurdjieff work, like Steiner's work on anthroposophy, and then we see that move into all these different things. People start to say space consciousness, and they're relating to UFOs as these higher spiritual beings. The root of all that stuff, this understanding, is coming from this 19th century period where the mystery schools let the information out. So brave people like Besant and Blavatsky are crucial. And Steiner, who, as we know, was harassed by the Nazis, and they burnt down his Goetheanum and all the rest of it. They didn't want the esoteric competition, let's say. So I think this is absolutely crucial. And so this is a good time for us to look at taking questions. Olivia, how are you doing over there?
Doing great.
Fantastic. It's a great crowd. And I'm always pleased to see so many of you. And I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for our newsletter and stay in touch with us that way, because I think the best way for us to keep this conversation going outside of these different factors relating to social media and all the rest of it, which is only good to a point, as we know, is direct mail. So if you're on that list, you get those updates, and those are the types of things I feel like I can reach out and give it to you directly. So that's important. How about questions, Olivia? Do you want to go into questions?
Well, the first thing, I just want to give a shout out to Tessa Dick's 5 kitties who are stealing her chicken.
5.
And we were having a great chat about Star Trek, just to ease into it, because these are heavy questions.
All right.
So what is your favorite episode of Star Trek?
City on the Edge of Forever. That's the original series.
Well, everybody says that. So what's your second?
Well, that was the question, wasn't it? Let's see. The Armageddon Factor.
Taste of Armageddon?
A Taste of Armageddon.
No, but there's the other one. The one with the Romulan commander.
Oh. Yeah, that is actually my favorite one when you come right down to it. That is Balance of Terror.
Yes.
Nothing beats that. Squire of Gothos. Somebody says we have a friend who would remind you of the Squire of Gothos. But we won't get into it, but there's no question he takes some of his cues from that. And of course, Q, the character, was developed off the Squire of Gothos. So wow, yeah. Star Trek's so amazing because of the writing, you know. But yeah, it's Balance of Terror, I think is the name of the episode. Yes. Somebody wrote Gurdjieff. There's so much to say about Gurdjieff. I'll tell you one thing where we can tie Gurdjieff in with this whole space aspect. Of course, Gurdjieff is the Russian philosopher who developed the Fourth Way teachings, and P.D. Ouspensky spent years bringing out his teachings, and they were all collected and put out in the book In Search of the Miraculous. I studied really hard and studied with groups dealing with the Gurdjieff work. The Enneagram, so many different things come out of that work. That's a separate show by itself. But one thing I will mention is that there's a book which is incredibly hard to read called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, where Gurdjieff does a kind of a James Joyce version of his work. And in there, it's all about Beelzebub, who's a space traveler, taking his rocket ship down to Earth and seeing what the humans are up to. Every sort of 500 years, he comes back and checks it out. And he's talking to his grandson here about how these humans still are having problems evolving. And that whole thing is a space opera. So let's keep that in mind. Gurdjieff is certainly right in the heart, in the core of that deep understanding. And where a lot of these mystery schools came forward and worked through people, like in Theosophy. With Gurdjieff, he was somebody who had actually been a member of a mystery school and come out. And he was kind of an unusual experiment in that way. But absolutely life-altering material. And Ouspensky's work, of course, all his beginning books before Gurdjieff. And then, like Tertium Organum and New Model of the Universe. What can you say about work like that? The basic fundamental understanding is that there's another finer reality that we're not sort of at the level to be able to see, and that we live in a kind of sleep. That's kind of the thrust of it. And that there are a number of tools in that work to wake up from that sleep. I can only imagine what a guy like Gurdjieff would say about this period, but wow. Okay, so Olivia.
So this is a big question. So Eleanor Keller is asking, is today's deep state the same as the mystery schools?
No. I think that in a nutshell, the mystery schools may manipulate groups like the deep state, but the deep state would be, we have to go to Peter Dale Scott's definition of the deep state. It includes aspects of intelligence. It includes aspects of organized crime. It includes aspects of Wall Street. It includes aspects of big oil, and it includes the contractor groups around the intelligence agencies, as well as the intelligence agencies. So like a Booz Allen Hamilton would be a crucial piece of that. And the way that we have to understand it is it's like a parallel state. So we have the public state here, and then there's this covert thing. And once in a while, in order to get something done for these power groups, that deep state has to move into the public sphere. So what he calls deep events are things like the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11. I would say the 2008 financial coup d'etat certainly qualifies. But, and Professor Scott's work is strictly working on that deep political aspect, and he found incredible ties into the continuity of government groups. So I think that's a really important factor to keep in mind, which is something about COG always shows up in these deep events. And anytime you look at any one of them, any of the important events that change policy, there's always a continuity of government player there. And we've talked about COG many times on this show. I did an episode with Professor Scott called The Doomsday Network, Continuity of Government and the Deep State. That's really where you would go for that kind of information. But yeah, Peter Dale Scott's work, I'm still trying to fathom it after 20 years. What do you got?
So Californology is asking, so were the mystery schools empathic to the population as a whole with respect to advancement? Maybe you should go over what a mystery school is and the different types you know about.
Well, it's definitely different levels of mystery schools, but the certainly, the Knights Templar is a great example of a mystery school. The Egyptian mystery schools, Pythagoras, and that whole wing of thought. The mystery schools exist. Gurdjieff has a way of describing them I think is very good, which is that what to do is always the public outreach of a group, a spiritual group, and the how to do it is always hidden. So, the great example is turn the other cheek. That is what to do in Christianity. But the how to do that is control your emotional body to a point where you could do that, like Gandhi did, for example, using nonviolence, and Martin Luther King did, in order to overwhelm people. It's like using their own force against them. This becomes a kind of a crucial aspect of it. A mystery school holds the knowledge. So there are many different kinds, but they're passed down all the way from the period of Atlantis into Egypt. And then, the Akhenaten period spawns a split in mystery schools in Egypt because of what he was trying to achieve. And so we have this legacy of these different schools. And supposedly it was split up a long time ago into the region of India was one region, the area of Egypt was another, and then the Caucasus, that whole region, sort of Persia. And we have these kind of offshoots of it over time. The Rosicrucians and, this Middle Age period would be part of a coming enlightenment of these groups. And really, they were moving, I'd say, into position. The other groups I think that are important when looking at mystery schools are Masons, because it's a public mystery school. And there's always been the idea of an esoteric and an exoteric circle. Certainly the Masons were at the very heart of some of the most incredible advances. And you'll find Masonry all throughout, and the Rosicrucians all throughout Theosophy and Anthroposophy, because those secret groups, for better or for worse, had to come forward. Now, people would say, aren't the Masons an evil Illuminati group? And that's where you really have to separate who is who and what's what, because the regular Masons are groups that they have certain legacy. Certainly the people who set up the country, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, are Masons. So we have to understand that on one aspect. There are groups that use Mason tactics, for example, who wouldn't be Masons, but we would blame them for things like that. So I think I mentioned earlier in the show that Masons actually did get blamed for things and were part of all these controversies in the 19th century. But I think when we look at it, the mystery schools understand cycles of time. They are tuned into what humanity is coming in and facing. And certainly their members can make predictions relating to things because they have that intuitive antenna going on. And if you look at the general public who are so busy running around and, trying to find comfort and escape, that their consciousness level is just so much further down. So I would definitely say that a mystery school, a true mystery school, is something that's been passed down over centuries, and they hold the ancient wisdom. And in many cases, I think they hold the ancient technology also.
Could you go into that a little bit more and how the UFO file fits in with the mystery schools?
Yeah, the UFO file is crucial because the mystery schools understand it. And as we've done through the show, we've shown how early aspects around the UFO file, including what Besant was trying to do with Keely's technology. Now, you could say Keely's technology wasn't a UFO. That's true. But obviously, it leans into that zone of what the UFOs are working with. And we have to remember the warnings, too, that come around work like Steiner and Besant, which is, if we get our hands on that technology before we're ready for it, then it's a pretty bad situation. And, Fitz often uses the term, what happens when you give a caveman a laser? So it's tricky. The society does have to be kind of willing and worthy. The problem is the people who've prevented the society from knowing about the advances that we could have had. It would actually improve society if we understood so many of these things. What they did under the guise of saving society from understandings that, things that they weren't ready for, is they developed it as a profit to themselves, and they had their own power games going on. And now, in fact, we see that through people like Corso and all the rest of it, that they've tried to resell us our own legacy there. So I think when we look at it for certain, the mystery schools have held that information relating to kind of primeval magic and really just that incredible knowledge. And so they hold the knowledge. They're not, they don't broadcast it, but you can find it. And certainly they had to make themselves known. The information that's available now in the spiritual literature, 200 years ago would have gotten people killed. I mean, so we're operating on a different level because of the crisis of the situation. And so we have access to incredible things. The thing is, can we use them? So do the mystery schools know about the UFO file? Absolutely. And I'm sure they're concerned with how the governments use the file against the general public, but they are also concerned that the general public getting their hands on the technology without understanding and being kind of spiritually aware enough might cause more harm than good.
How does that connect to Atlantis?
Well, in Atlantis, according to the main sources that we have for Atlantis on the esoteric side, like Steiner, like Theosophy, and like Casey, they had achieved through using the crystals this incredible advance of technology. They could fly airships. They could fly into space. They could fly through mountains. One of the interesting readings from Casey that I found is that they could take pictures through mountains. I don't understand how that works, but he basically described them with television and all powered by this crystal. And what happened at a certain point was the crystal, it basically was a malfunction, and that we had brought ourselves to a point where we no longer had the ability with the technology to spiritually interface with it, which was a crucial aspect that the Atlanteans had for the foundation of the civilization. They lost that through a group that he calls the Belial group. And the Belial group were kind of might is right group. And the original group that harvested the technology was a spiritual group called the Laws of One. And it has nothing to do with the Law of One channeling. It's just a line that Casey came up with relating to a group that was operated in Atlantis. And so ultimately, the crystal and its information was hidden after it caused all these disasters. And as a matter of fact, according to Casey, it's in the Sphinx. In the Sphinx right paw, the Hall of Records, is the information on how to build one of these things. It's probably why so many people are after it. But yeah, absolutely. The crystal aspect, there's no doubt that the Atlanteans interfaced also with off-world civilizations. There are Casey readings that talk about a Mayan priestess who her whole preparation was to interface with visitors from other worlds. Well, for people who follow the Casey readings, there's your off-world visitor UFO file aspect. So certainly in the Casey readings, the richest material dealing with Atlantis by far.
Heather Polly is asking, how will we ever be ready for the tech? But I think linked with that is the question, how will we ever be ready for the truth? Because the people who are in the chat tonight, are all really prepared. They want disclosure, they want the truth, they feel they're ready for it. But many of our friends and family members are not. So what would it take for our society to truly be ready to handle the technology and the truth?
What's it going to take? Well, we've been given the examples, we've been given the information. I think when the mystery schools let the information come forward, see what historians and kind of social observers, sociologists look at when they see this period. It's sort of like, oh, Mary Baker Eddy and Theosophy and all this stuff came up. And, it was because there was a questioning around religious values and all the rest of it. There's a very superficial line there that's true. But the thing that was happening underneath it is what Steiner was talking about, which is there was a group inside the mystery schools that decided, the scientific materialism is going to blow everything down. It's going to take everything down. And within 100 years, according to their estimate, humankind's ability to relate to the spiritual life is just going to be gone because they've reduced everything in this formula and they're programming everybody with it. It's the biggest mind control experiment in history, and it's been working for over almost 200 years. But what I think is crucial when you see that is that these groups that come up are absolutely crucial because they bring us the information around technology and how it was used in Atlantis. It brings our real history back. That's one. Two, it brings your spiritual connection. That's two. Three, it gives you psychic tools. So it awakens your own faculties. Well, Theosophy was set up to help create the conditions to invite in the next root race, right? The next advancement in human evolution. I mean, we can't get it with Family Guy and, Netflix and crazy political reporting and Rachel Maddow. I mean, that is designed to keep you in this low level of this low state of fighting and to keep you in a low level of really, it's a mentality that is the lowest possible mentality of conflict, fear, selfishness, and all the rest of it. And they've done a really good job with that. But the groups, I think, that came forward in that period in response to scientific materialism laid the foundation. And I don't think, I think that we have incredible people now, and we're going to see come out of the woodwork people of their ilk. I don't think we've seen so much of it recently, but I think it's going to happen because I think that's how it was designed. But yeah, that's how I would say it relates. What else you got?
Lee Veltman is asking for your thoughts on Esalen Institute and the Human Potential Movement.
Yeah, well, those were really offshoots of Theosophy, if you really think about it. And when you look at some of these groups that were rising in the 60s had so much about communal living. It had so much about psychic research. It had so much about yoga, meditation, and all the rest of it. And it took us into the 70s, which is an incredible period of understanding and working with these types of concepts. And side by side, there were economic and crime problems and all the rest of it. But I think that there are opportunists in the mix, and you get that a lot in the 60s and Est and all the rest of it. And now we have, what is that one I really can't stand? It's the Forum or something. These are the kinds of things that they have. But in general, I think what the 60s were trying to do, there's that great line from the My Dinner with Andre, which is like, the 60s represented the last burst of the human being, before it was snuffed out by corporate greed. So there is a certain aspect of that. And I do think that a lot of the idealists and the peace movements of the 60s were taken over and were forced down this road of sort of free love and drugs. And I think it destroyed the idea, so that people wouldn't start to think, anytime you would start to think, oh, I'm into peace and all the rest of it, there'd be this idea back there of the 60s people who were indulgent and, didn't want to work or whatever.
I guess Trump is hurling missiles at Syria right now. So everybody's talking about
there is an attack. This is very interesting, and I will do a report on this. We have been expecting it to happen. There was this whole occasion of this chemical attack quote. And of course, it's ridiculous that Assad would be using chemical weapons on his own people at this point, when every time he's gone to do it. As a matter of fact, Assad's winning that war, so whoever is using that kind of material is trying to instigate this very action. And Trump falling into it, and the addition of John Bolton to his cabinet may spell doom for his administration if he stays on that line. It's an incredibly bad move, and I think it's exactly the kind of scenario the deep state wants. But I think that we're not going to lose our focus on this. So what other questions do you have?
Okay, so Cassandra Hellwig is so smart. So many great questions. So,
like so many of you are.
She is discussing, she hopes that you will discuss the Luciferian aspect of secret societies, and can you explain the connection between the UFO file and demons and Satanism, since a lot of the early Theosophists were satanic, supposedly.
No, they weren't. Well, the way I would see it is really, when you look, you have to go deep on the mystery schools. You can't look at it looking through the prism of, are we trying to find some Illuminati occult thing going on back there? I think that people like Crowley, you could call, working with black arts and things like that. Theosophists aren't anything like Satanists. So that's a complete misread. They're trying to raise their consciousness. Now they are kind of, they started off with what you could call a kind of Western esotericism, and they moved heavily into an Eastern identification. And there's a fascinating story about how that happened, which is Steiner tells the story of the Western initiators backing off because they realized that Blavatsky had some distortion in her soul relating to Christianity, and it had to do with a past life as part of the Inquisition, where she had been tortured and that whole thing. And interestingly enough, in the Theosophical literature, they list Besant's, one of her lives was Giordano Bruno, who was trying to show that these different astronomical elements kind of get us out of flat Earth thinking. And, he was executed. And that always struck me as fascinating, that at the end of Besant's life that came out. And it's one of those few things I think would be absolutely true. But I think when we look at these groups, there's always things to criticize. You can criticize anything from Findhorn to Theosophy or whoever, but the bulk of the information that they bring forward and the steps that they make, I think there's incredible progress there. I do think Theosophy took the slide at a certain point and Anthroposophy rose, because Steiner was there with all the information holding his spiritual truth, and he didn't fall into some of the excesses that Theosophy did because they became so big. One thing I wanted to mention, which I didn't get to, which is that the Waldorf schools, of course, the Waldorf aspect of that is the Waldorf Astoria. And the Waldorf Astoria company worked with, and this goes back to Astor again, because Astor created that company. The original Astor, who came here and became a millionaire, he was from Waldorf. That's where the name comes from. So here we have that whole loop closing, which is Astor and the Waldorf schools. And the Waldorf schools, incredible, ambitious childhood education, ties right into the Astors, who were trying to get John Keely's information off the ground and investing $5 million into him, and Annie Besant taking his research when it was under siege by these different forces trying to collect it and submerge it, these different corporate forces. So that's an incredible connecting of the dots with the Waldorf schools and the Waldorf Astoria. And now we understand John Jacob Astor a little bit better as more than just the guy who, was the big millionaire who died on the Titanic. He had a much deeper history, and he even wrote his own book about off-world civilizations. As a novel, of course. Okay, what else?
Okay, so I just want to
These are great
continue,
questions tonight.
Cassandra Helwig also asked, Annie Besant founded the Lucifer Trust, name changed to Lucis Trust. There's only one religious chapel in the UN headquarters, the Meditation Room, which is run by, all groups, the Lucis Trust. The Rudolf Steiner schools were all sponsored by the Lucis Trust. And she just realized that the Lucis Trust logo has an X.
Hey, that's great. Well, here's what you have to understand about a Lucifer back then, which is there was all of the, there was a separation between the devil idea and Lucifer. And the devil in anthroposophy is Ahriman. Ahriman is what is classically the devil. And in Goethe's Faust, he points out in specific, that's Ahriman. What happened was these characters got blended together. And so in Theosophy and anthroposophy, the Lucifer aspect is referred to is a totally different thing from what we would understand as satanic. They had a publication which was about higher knowledge called Lucifer, which is where this came from. But my feeling is that with the identification of Lucifer all those years, that they shouldn't have tried to say, hey, we understand what this term really means. There was so much thought form identification. These people were all about thought forms. One of my favorite books is C.W. Ledbetter's Thought Forms, and where it talks about when thought forms collect around something. And he would make interesting impressions, like a house that was in disrepair on a street. If an esoterically minded person were looking on that, he would see the house, but he'd also see the thought forms of all these people thinking that the house was ugly. And so the thing about names and how names are so important in mystery schools, if they understood the separation of Ahriman and Lucifer, these groups would try to come forward and say, well, we'll use the correct names for things. But there's such an identification around the name that you can't, it's impossible to reprogram people around what the name means. So even if I think the Ahriman aspect coming out of Persian mythology is absolutely crucial, and there's a book called Lucifer and Ahriman by Steiner that separates those two very well. But yeah, don't ever think that anthroposophy or theosophy have anything to do with Satanism. It's quite the opposite.
Vril and Tool.
Wow. Those, I mean, Vril is mentioned in Scott Elliott's work and in John Keely's work. Vril is understood as that life force that can power things. And Bulwer Lytton, who is a really kind of incredible science fiction writer of his time, he's the one who came up with the idea of the Vril. And the Nazi groups used it and coveted the themes and wanted to develop this Vril, very much like Keely's ether. It's a life force that can power our technology. When we get around the UFO aspects and we go into the Bob Lazar story, he's talking about how the craft is powered by the thing that they figured out was the pilot basically powers the craft with his being. He uses his being to power the craft. Well, that's where that research is going. The mystery school understanding and the UFO understanding are closer and closer together as we redevelop those things. The problem is one of the things that many UFO researchers understand is when they get around this technology, it's not easy to redevelop and rework because so much of it requires a higher consciousness to operate it in the first place. And you can't just be, kind of a lowlife and fly a flying saucer. So, the UFO technology requires things. It requires you to be on a certain level. And so certainly the schools that came out of that and the Tula Society, these are deep esoteric groups setting up, leading up to the Nazi aspects. But very much like Steiner looking at the Nazi part, he said, the Nazis really have it backwards. We're going into a totally different thing. And their whole concern is about blood ritual magic and, purity of blood ritual magic and all this kind of thing. He said that was a different epoch for Earth advancement, where we've moved into something totally different. And in fact, if you look at the Nazi development and what they did, even though they understood things on an occult level, it was like they were operating 2,000 years previously, and the world had just gone beyond that kind of dictatorial approach, and so he saw them. He saw the entire country heading into a gigantic disaster before his death in January 25th, just like we're seeing ours going into disaster with firing off missiles at Syria.
Could you comment a little bit on Ouspensky, what he was experiencing with the Russian Revolution, since this is happening? We're talking about consciousness, and these strikes are happening right now, and his insights, I think, could be useful.
Yeah. Well, in brief, there's a book called Letters, 1917, which P.D. Ouspensky is the Russian philosopher who dealt with Gurdjieff's work and really brought it out to the public and developed the groups. And J.G. Bennett was his disciple, who really did a lot of incredible work. All of their work, you will learn more about yourself, and it's incredible information. But the thing about Letters is it's not his teaching, and it's not him musing about esoteric principles. It's literally letters of him writing about the Russian Revolution and the way that stories spread and how false information got out there and how different groups within the government that wanted this to happen because they wanted the people to fight while they were taking over. And it's absolutely incredible because the people are sitting ducks, so and they're like, oh, there's a famine about to happen, or they would let these little things out. And now when we're on YouTube and we see all these things, trying to become clickbait for you to get into fear and, depopulation and all these things and FEMA camps, it's not that you shouldn't be aware of these things, but you should also be aware of how they're used, because the idea of manipulating you with truths that are stretched into these half-truths that are stretched into lies, a full lie, are very dangerous. But I really recommend that book for anybody.
And there was that Ouspensky was asking about the mystery schools and why the information isn't readily available if it would uplift humanity.
I don't think he ever got an answer to that question.
Well, no, he did. It's in the movie on YouTube that we've seen.
No, the movie is just the
it's from the book.
It's just from In Search of the Miraculous, yeah.
So, and he said that the masses don't want the truth.
Yes, there is that also. Well, it is interesting to consider when we look at the mystery schools and we think about their object and we think about who they are, if they have been holding the higher purpose of humanity and moving us forward as a kind of a helpful shadow, as we're moving forward without actually interfering with our will. It's so funny because we get into the story when people talk about off-world civilizations, but the mystery schools are something that have a much more, like a much easier trail for us to follow and understand. They're much more here with us, and they are evolved, spiritually. When you talk about the masters that dealt with Theosophy, like El Moriah, or what they were basically creating, this kind of Saint Germain, they were operating on this higher level, and they're within our reality. And then there are things outside of our reality, like when we talk about off-world civilizations. But to consider what the mystery schools hold in terms of advanced information, and how there are mystery schools that deal specifically with the political side of it. And I'm sure that there are members from those mystery schools who end up inside the political process, trying to change the conversation, trying to change the policies, trying to change us from a society that is destructive. But I think it's a very worthy question. What are the mystery schools interested in? What are they working toward? They're holding the torch for humanity's future. There's no question about it. And they do let it out. There is steganography associated with the mystery schools. And I think that the information coming forward that we really fully assimilated even the messages that we got from Steiner's work, Gurdjieff's work, Kesey's work, Theosophy's work? How are we doing on that almost 100 years later? It's a really worthy question.
Okay, switching gears. The Entrepreneur Economist says, were the Astors and the Rockefellers at war? How does it affect deep state today? And Count Von Smokey says the Astors were against the Federal Reserve. Is there a connection of the Titanic sinking in connection with the Astors? Perhaps that's an X.
It is, you know, I brought that up earlier. I think that that research is good because it was a year before the Federal Reserve was created in a kind of a very sketchy, it's that book, Jekyll Island, which by Edward Griffith. And, you know, that's not, that's just a part of history and how it was done. I think there were forces. Remember, J.P. Morgan is a big part of the Federal Reserve story and the, you know, the raids on the bank and all the rest of it. And J.P. Morgan's a big part of the Tesla story because he was, you know, originally he was into it. He was like, this is going to be great. And then he realizes this guy wants to give everyone free energy, wireless energy, the same way we have Wi-Fi right now. And so their job became, let's take him down completely. But the idea of the Astor and the Rockefellers at odds, you know, I've heard this also. And I think what I see is anybody who got in the Rockefellers' way, the Astors were famous for real estate and fur, but they were getting into railroad stuff. And we all know that Rockefeller wanted to dominate. And so I think there is a real battle there. And I think that the Rockefellers really show a cruel streak that some of these other groups really don't. And so there's more of a cruel, manipulative streak in history. When we look at the Rockefellers, there were some who had higher ideals. And I think Lawrence Rockefeller, who came forward trying to get the UFO story out, was quite different from, say, a David Rockefeller. Another thing I should mention that I didn't mention earlier about Brooke Astor, who lived to 105, is that Kissinger and David Rockefeller, during that court case that was going on that I referred to earlier, Kissinger and Rockefeller came forward with messages saying, hey, you know, Brooke Astor is being taken advantage of by her son, and the court should do something about it. That gives you some idea that even at that late stage, the kind of circles that Brooke Astor moved in, and she was the descendant of the Astors. So, you know, she really held the name and held the title there. So the Astors, here's the question mark for us going into the next episode, the Astors and the Trumps, because both New York developers, both came from Germany and became millionaires coming here with nothing. Very unusual, both heavily associated with the UFO file, as we've discovered. Okay, great. We'll take a couple more questions and then we're going to wrap it up.
Okay. Terry B, did Tesla also claim to be channeling aliens? What's his connection to Mars?
He did claim that there was communication there. And it's very important that officially to the scientific community, he claimed that the message was counting. 1, ... 2, ... 3, ... That was the message that he got. He was absolutely convinced because of the way it was set up. He had checked out about lightning and all the rest of it. He understood it was a message from space. So he wrote this lengthy letter to the scientific community saying, brethren, this is it. I've got the first contact here. And there's also stories in relation to Tesla talking about the satellites that he felt were monitoring things from off-world civilizations monitoring the Earth. So there's a lot of rich detail in there. And I think that the Airship models, I was looking at them, I didn't print them out for tonight, but his Airship models, wow, they look a lot like those cigar-shaped saucers that we see and the crafts that are known for that. So it is pretty amazing. What else you got?
I'm trying to find No Name's question. Please ask Daniel if he has found any evidence that Donald Trump is a psychic. I found a couple of MSM articles that hinted that he might be a psychic. I sent an email to DJ about some other stuff, but included a link to one of those articles. Did you get that?
You know, there's a lot of email that comes through. I'm sure I did. I think that there's a lot. Someone who is very close to Trump, and I found this very interesting, talked about how he was into Norman Vincent Peale, who was an incredible positive thinking figure. That shows an openness to dealing with the mind potential. And once you get to that level, you're only a stone's throw from dealing with psychic information. I've included Jean Dixon's information. She's such an incredible person. Said on the show, I thought she was, at one point in our history, the most powerful woman on the planet, because she was helping presidents decide policies using her psychic abilities. But certainly the fact that Nixon says in his letter to Trump, I predict you'll win if you run for president. Well, Nixon, who's incredibly close to Jean Dixon, who visited his house, the White House, that is, over 80 times while he was in office, or phoned. I mean, those aren't all visits. Probably the majority are phone calls. But she seems to me the one who predicted it. And I think that's absolutely an important thing, that even the word predict comes up there. So yeah, absolutely fascinating. And do I think Trump is has kind of a feel for psychic activity? I do. I also think that you know, we can see he is easily influenced also. And so he probably has some very, very bad advisors around him right now. What else you got?
Jack Russell was asking about Bigelow selling Skinwalker Ranch.
Yes.
Do you know who he sold it to and why?
You know, I got information about who it was, and it's fascinating because when we think about it, you know, Skinwalker Ranch has everything. Skinwalker Ranch has Greys, it has Sasquatch, it has interdimensional wolves, you know, and interdimensional wolf who they shoot, and like, you know, he's still doing his thing. So it's got poltergeist, you know, so it obviously was this incredible vortex. And I give Bigelow a lot of credit for back then buying it and trying to figure out exactly what was going on. This is apparently where George Knapp got involved with him. And I think that involvement was much more fruitful back then. And I think this incredibly, I don't even know what to call it. It's such a disgraceful op with Luis Elizondo trying to walk forward this phony narrative about UFOs from the CIA, and Bob Bigelow funding it with money from Harry Reid. You know, it's pretty rough. So it distorts the thinking around Bigelow Ranch, but he did give it up. I do think there was genuine phenomena there. And I think that there are those places, just like West Virginia was, Point Pleasant, in the late 60s, when this incredible wave of things happened that involved men in black and involved UFO sightings. It involved this incredible opening of this vortex, and it wasn't always pleasant. Of course, the Mothman being the ultimate piece of that. But I think that these things do happen, and it's relating to time and place. And so Skinwalker Ranch, I think everything I've read about it seems completely legit.
JJK, is there a place where Jean Dixon's papers can be accessed? Did she leave any of her work to anyone?
She did, in fact, leave it to an inventor friend of hers. And he made sure that all that stuff was put away nicely and kept and all the rest of it. And then he died. And this bizarre thing happened where all of her stuff got auctioned off in Washington, D.C. So I don't know, it's spread out pieces or all over the joint, but she certainly left a record in books. There's Ruth Montgomery's biography of her. Certainly, you know, some of the deeper things that she was dealing with, working with Nixon in the 70s. I think the 70s is kind of a crucial period for Dixon. And she had been giving presidents advice since FDR. So I don't think we understand Dixon's legacy at all. I think she got caught up as a marketing thing. And there were like, she was doing an astrology thing, and I think that they farmed it out at a certain point. And so it got bizarre with, like, you know, Jean Dixon predicts kind of thing, became an institution. But in truth, I absolutely think she had the gift, and she was a woman in the heart of history.
Freethinker is asking, do you think Trump is being blackmailed?
Could be. I think he'd be a tough guy to blackmail, but when you get up at that level, there's always a control file aspect. And I think a lot of the things that they were trying to pull with the phony Russian dossier and all the rest of it, Trump was a millionaire playboy for years, and I'm sure there's tons of compromising information on him. The thing is, does any of that stuff matter? The important thing is that the American people put him in office. If Trump doesn't take the opportunity, if he becomes influenced by the war party, like Bolton and those people, then he's going to miss the incredible chance that the American people have given him. And it looks with some of the reports tonight that he is making those wrong moves. That would be a shame because, I do feel like that opportunity has been given to him. I do feel that the war hawks really wanted Hillary Clinton in, and that the phony UFO disclosure group also wanted Clinton in to pull off a fake UFO threat idea. And I think that when they decided to try to do it while Trump was still in office, it ain't working out so well. But we'll see. We'll definitely see.
Tessa Dick says connection between Trump's lawyer being raided and Trump bombing Syria.
Yeah. Oh, the raid on Trump's lawyer's office is it's an overreach by the deep state using a Democratic push, and an operative, Robert Mueller, who was the FBI director during 9/11. Interestingly enough, a lot of people have said that Trump should fire Mueller and stuff. It's very tricky territory, but that overreach that we see, it's one thing we can instantly identify if like a president does something to protect himself, then it's easy to identify, hey, it's unconstitutional. But these guys taking the actions that they are, raiding his personal lawyer's office, that's war. That's a deep state war against the presidency. Generally, I would say the CIA versus the presidency, much like the JFK situation, and that's a shooting war when they invade his office. There's no question.
And Comey?
The pits. Comey wants to come out and talk about if Trump is balding or if he has tan lines, whatever.
Small hands.
Right. I mean, Comey really is a disgrace. And I think that he was working as a political operative. He was working one side of the street. He got in trouble. He started working the other side of the street. Didn't look so good. And I think he got what was coming to him when he was fired, frankly. And I haven't seen anything in what Comey brought forward that shows me that he had the greater interest of the company, of the country in mind. I feel like he was really worrying about his own future. And he was an important thing, I think, to keep in mind, that aspect of the deep state that helped put Trump in office. There's no question that aspect is the mafia. I mean, the mafia has such a deep role working in the heart of the political process. And I think the mafia is familiar with Trump from his dealings in New York. But the other aspect, which is the manipulative aspect, the CIA that uses the mafia, they're using a lawyer who once prosecuted heavy-duty mafia figures. He was their pet. That's Comey. And so you have two aspects of the deep state fighting each other there. And I think that the more loyal aspect to the country is this America First group. And I think the other one is all about corporate control. So the deep state aspect, using Comey, when they flushed him, they lost a pretty big ally. So I just feel like Comey's good riddance, and the book is the most ridiculous thing.
Lee Veltman, what are Daniel's thoughts on the QAnon phenomena?
Well, Lee, if you've been following my work, I think I have a theory about Q, that Q is actually about IQ. It's to say, how low is your IQ? That you can be run around town by this anonymous poster giving you conspiracy literature from 20 years ago and pretending it's the real deal. So Q is an exercise, a marketing exercise against rational people is to see who we got out there and what can we do with them. And I think it's gone beyond their expectations. Was there originally an intelligence person who wanted to put some information out in late October of last year? Could be. Whatever this thing is has nothing to do with that. And no one's going to follow your white rabbit. Q. That stuff, think of it as IQ, and then how low can we go?
Titan Blooded was asking, mafia, military keeping Trump alive, but also, do aliens protect Trump?
So we know that this is going to be a great question to almost end on. Well, here's the thing that I think is interesting. I think off-world groups watch closely what we do here. And do they assess conditions of when their presence would be known? We talked about mystery schools. Here's a fascinating thing about the UFO file. The deep state political process doesn't want you to know about it because it takes away their power in their mind. That's one. The mystery schools aren't sure if the public should know about it either because they're afraid in the wrong hands it would get misused. The visitors themselves also want to keep their presence a secret because they don't want to interfere with the population straight up, or because there are aspects of what they're doing that they don't want to be interfered with in terms of testing or whatever salvage operations are going on. So you get a wall of secrecy from all these different sides, and we cut right through the middle trying to find out what the real answer around the thing is. In the final analysis, the people who hold the secrecy don't have any better ethics or ideals than the general public. In my opinion, they're a lot lower. And that I think they've demonstrated that over and over again. The information would be much better in the public domain, and you would have to hope that the public would learn how to use it wisely, for sure. And, I think there's a place for doing that kind of change in a culture carefully, but I think it's fascinating that there's so many things on the side of secrecy relating to the UFO aspect. I always have thought it was fascinating.
All right, this is a great question to end on. Chris Davies, is this a dumb question? But does DJ actually believe in aliens and UFOs?
Interesting. No, it's not a dumb question. I think when you get right down to it, the most simple questions are important. And I agree with you. It's good to clarify what it is. I absolutely believe that we have off-world visitors here visiting an advanced craft. And I think it's important that the entire government structure, in my opinion, based on my research, is set up around the fact of managing that aspect of the UFO file, and everything else seems to be a secondary consideration relating to that. I do feel that, it's not easy to absolutely know what's happening in the realm of visitors because there may be many different types. But the information that I think holds up very strongly, there's a range to it. But even some of the older stuff like Frank Edwards and John Keel, you get an idea that there's some mystery there that's a little bit deeper than just crafts flying, unknown crafts flying in the sky and that kind of edge of the visitors. So I really like, I like to look at Mac's work dealing with contactees. I think we get pretty good information there. And I like to really look at the hardcore cases and what we can learn from them. Things about, radar operators following. We already know that the stuff is out there. And so I think the next stage with us is not to worry anymore about the question of are they there or not. I think that we're in a stage where we, without all the hoopla around disclosure and all the rest of it, just move into the topic. The steganography around X helps us a lot more than we think, because we may have a tool now which they can't take away because it's already been out there. They've been using it. And if we have now tripped into it, then we have a tool that helps us assess all their history of concealing the facts around it. We get, I think, a much better jump on them by researching it through that prism. for sure. Excellent. Wow.
All right, I'm going to give you one last question because Rebel was giving me a hard time. So Rebel's going to get the last question. DJ, what are your thoughts on the Antarctic Treaty?
Well, there's a few you're going to have to specify which one, because there's the original idea of a treaty between the Soviets and the US around it. And then there are people saying that there's a Nazi one, and then there's the UFO idea. So you're going to have to specify.
It's got to be the UFO idea.
See, I don't think anytime.
1967, Rebel says.
1967.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that there's nothing that we have in the literature of official interaction around Antarctica that helps us get the answers that we need. I would think that the idea around Admiral Byrd's work gives us the first indication. The fact that he worked with the Nazis on the record, because they weren't at war with us at the time, to help them with their expedition is important. And then later on into our period of time, looking at Lockheed Martin going there and setting up is absolutely crucial. I think the work that Joseph Farrell did covering all the incredible officials that were going is absolutely important also. So I don't think that we have good answers around Antarctica. And I said this before, I think Antarctica, it's harder to get information about it than it is about space, because it's such a desolate location. It's so frozen, it's so inhospitable that it's almost, we almost have to revert more to kind of projecting ideas at it, because I don't think we know a great deal about it. I do think things like the Pura Reis map that show it without the ice on top of it suggest that there could have been an ancient civilization there. Although for my money, it's much easier to get at the civilization that's around the Bimini area off of Florida. It's the last kind of vestige of Atlantis. A real expedition there, things like the Bimini Wall, you'd probably have a better shot at than Antarctica, which is incredibly difficult, which is probably why people like the story so much. And Olivia, you get the final question.
You mean, okay. Well, actually, Giovanni Delgado wanted to know if you can recall the names of the people Eisenhower sent to Area 51 to retrieve the UFO file after threatening to send in the army.
He sent, Nixon was one of them. And the person that he sent is the whistleblower named Cooper that Linda Moulton Howe interviewed. And there's a 20-part series on Earth Files. I think it is for members, but there's certainly a lot of information about Cooper. That's Kewper. And the Cooper Cantwheel aspect of that whole operation. But certainly that event sounds absolutely right on to me, because Eisenhower wasn't somebody to be cut out of the loop to his face. This is Eisenhower of D-Day. Do you think he's going to take that from some, bookish CIA person? Well, we've got the secrecy under control. He wasn't the type. So he wanted to have the answers. And Nixon was just the kind of guy to head up the program because he was incredibly smart. So the fact that he ran the CIA Blue Book aspect, that comes to us from Cooper, so that by the time we get to the Merritt story beneath the White House, it makes a lot more sense. And Nixon funding the Emmenegger documentary. Wow, incredible information. What a great time it's been having everyone here. Of course, I encourage everyone to go to darkjournalist.com. We're going to continue with the X series, and it's only going to go deeper. But we have some great guests coming up too. Some of these shows have been important to just do and lay out the information, you and I going back and forth on it, because it's a lot, it's a lot of foundation for us to get at it. But we do have some great guests coming up to kind of sift through it and really go deep with you. And I really do appreciate it. Please do.
I'm going to let Rika have the last word
Rika,
here.
the hopeful voluntarist.
How effective will a one-woman protest be at her local Lockheed? So I assume that's Rika herself considering doing this.
Well, see, it's interesting. As we look at Annie Besant, she certainly stood up to all kinds of forces that were arrayed against her. And they specifically didn't like women doing it. What I've realized really is that women have led the way in pushing the information out there. And so without Blavatsky and Besant and, you know, some of these incredible figures, and I really do want to say this about Besant. I've shown a few pictures of her, and we'll end on this. But certainly, Rika, I can tell you have a lot of chutzpah. You, whatever you're going to do it right. My feeling is that when we look at somebody, we can kind of take the figure of a person like Besant. I'll show us one last time. We'll close out on this. There's somebody who took the conditions, took the ball that came her way, and she moved through standing up for the workers' rights. She moved through cutting through the religious oppression of her own upbringing. She moved through on women's rights. She moved for home rule for India and Ireland. People forget that very often. She was involved in both. She was Gandhi's inspiration. I mean, this woman was incredible. And, you know, so they're all a great inspiration to us for what can we do. They didn't have the internet on their side. And so that's something also. So yes, but great to have you out there. And I know you've got the great spirit. Everybody's been really great tonight with the questions. And Olivia, you did fantastic as usual. Thank you very much. Next week, we will see you on Friday, and we're going to go deep into the X. In the meantime, go to darkjournalist.com. Do sign up for the newsletter. That's the best way to stay in touch with us. Subscribe to the show. $4, a little over $4 a month. That's really the kind of support and, you know, getting behind the show. And I always say get behind the things that are giving you the good information and really pull out of the stuff that is soul destroying. So make sure that you get the things that you want. And so I always say that there are sites out there like Solari, like He's a Death Star, like Dark Journalist. There's a kind of a trend of information. And I can tell you that when I look at it, it was not available there if you go back even 5-10 years ago. This information is here now. It's here for you. It's your time. And just like we were talking about the time of anthroposophy and theosophy and the Gurdjieff work, this is another very special time. So get behind the work, spread it, tell everyone about it, and we definitely appreciate it. So thank you very much. And
let's all pray for Syria.
Well, we're going to get some real details about that, and we'll do a special report on it. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a lot of misinformation around it, but I'll tell you, fundamentally, I can say this, that it's a mistake for the United States to get involved in militarily in any way with Syria under the current conditions. So, you know, I don't have all the details in front of me, but that's certainly a big mistake. But certainly raising our own awareness about what's really behind a lot of these moves can help us to be more prepared on our side. And but yeah, certainly prayer is an incredible antidote for war. So thank you again. Incredible people out there. And I'm really glad to see everyone with us tonight. So it's well, it's Olivia's guess for tonight's.
A lot of people say they hate PayPal and would like an option, but they can send a check, can't they?
You can go to, if you go to the darkjournalist.com/contribute.php. Now there's a button up there. If you go to Dark Journalist, it just says contribute. You hit that, and it gives you the ability to not sign up with a PayPal account, but just use your credit card. And that's really the best way to do that. And, you know, hopefully have more options in the future, but I can appreciate it. But you can use your card there. You just select the credit card option after you hit the contribute button, and you make the amount for $49. So yeah, but if you have any problems with it, email us at info@darkjournalist.com. We appreciate the incredible feedback that you guys give us. And I always say this is an interactive situation. So any of the information that we get from you really works to really fill the picture out nicely, because so many of you are so well informed, and I really appreciate that. So have a fantastic night. Olivia, again, bravo. And think of what kind of organic tasty that you're in the mood for tonight, because we're probably heading out for food after this.
I want an ice cream cone.
That's interesting. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
We will talk about it. So thank you very much, and have a great evening, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Talk to you soon. An ice cream cone.